Water bill, third notice. Jury duty, third notice. Mortgage bill, second notice. Flancrest Enterprises.
Oops, that's for me. Flancrest Enterprises is my home business.
You liar. You don't have a home business. Why would you make up a lie like that?
No, it's true. Mon and I sell religious hook rugs over the internet.
Internet, eh?
Yes, indeedy. Making some good scratch, too.
Scratch, eh?
Yep.
Maud, eh?
Homer, what are you doing?
No time to answer that, Marge. I'm setting up a home office for my new business enterprise.
What business enterprise?
Ever heard of a little thing called the internet?
Internet, eh?
Oh, yeah. Everybody's making money off the internet except us. We've fallen behind. Way behind.
Is that my good butter?
Can't discuss that now, Marge. I have to write another delicious memo. Memo. Oh, what am I going to call my internet company? All the good names are taken. Oh, wait, I've got it. Flancrest Enterprises. Oh!
What exactly is it your company does again?
Oh, this industry moves so fast, it's really hard to tell. That's why I need a name that's cutting edge, like Cutco or Edgecom, Interslice. Come on, Marge, you're good at these. Help me out.
How about CompuGlobal HyperMegaNet?
Fine, it's not important. What really matters is my title. I think I'll make myself Vice President. No, wait. Junior Vice President. CompuGlobal HyperMegaNet. Junior Vice President Homer Simpson speaking. How may I direct your call? It's Patty.
Oh, Captain Janeway. Lace, the final brassiere. Oh, hurry up. I'm a busy man. Ugh, this high-speed modem is intolerably slow. Hey, what the... the Internet King. I wonder if he can provide faster nudity.
Welcome to the internet, my friend. How can I help you?
I'm interested in upgrading my 28.8 kilobaud internet connection to a 1.5 megabit fiber optic T1 line. Will you be able to provide an IP router that's compatible with my token ring Ethernet LAN configuration?
Can I have some money now? Oh, they have the internet on computers now.
Homer, Bill Gates is here.
Bill Gates? Billionaire computer nerd Bill Gates? Oh my god, oh my god! Get out of sight, Marge! I don't want this to look like a two-bit operation!
Mr. Simpson?
You don't look so rich.
Don't let the haircut fool you. I'm exceedingly wealthy.
Get a load of the bowl job, Marge.
Your internet ad was brought to my attention, but I can't figure out what, if anything, CompuGlobal HyperMegaNet does. So rather than risk competing with you, I've decided simply to buy you out.
This is it, Marge. I poured my heart and soul into this business, and now it's finally paying off. We're rich, richer than astronauts.
Homer, quiet. You'll queer the deal.
Oh, right. I reluctantly accept your proposal.
Well, everyone always does. Buy 'em out, boys!
Hey, what the hell's going on?
Oh, I didn't get rich by writing a lot of checks.
Deleuze and the Internet. I found myself more and more wary of Google out of some primal lizard-brain fear of giving too much control of my data to one source. John Battelle. There can be no doubt that the Internet has transformed practically every aspect of contemporary life, especially the way we think about the body and its relation to identity and to place, once the twin cornerstones of social existence. In social life, you are always someone from somewhere, the son or daughter of so-and-so from such and such town. These details of our existence, which are essentially historical, although they may sometimes take a form biologists think belongs to their domain, gender, race, body shape, segment us in different ways, slicing and dicing us this way and that so that we adhere to the conventions and demands of the socius itself. Quote, "We are segmented in a binary fashion, following the great major dualist oppositions, social classes, but also men, women, adults, children, and so on. We are segmented in a circular fashion, in ever larger circles, ever wider discs or coronas, like Joyce's letter. my affairs, my neighborhood's affairs, my cities, my countries, the world's. We are segmented in a linear fashion, along a straight line or a number of straight lines, of which each segment represents an episode or proceeding. As soon as we finish one proceeding, we begin another, forever proceduring or procedured, in the family, in the school, in the army, on the job. Deleuze and Guattari, 1,000 Plateaus. These segmentations penetrate our being. They appear and even feel bodily, especially the apparently natural attributes of gender and race, but they are not, for all that, visceral. Deleuze and Guattari are very specific about this. They describe these socially orchestrated captures of the body, gender, race, class, work, family, and so on, as incorporeal transformations. If today, as Deleuze foresaw with typical acuity in his short essay on what he labeled the society of control, our credit card and social security numbers are more significant identity and place markers than the color of our skin or where we went to school. That isn't because the meat of our bodies has lately been superseded in its cultural significance by our bloodless digital profile. Rather, what has happened is that one incorporeal apparatus of capture has been succeeded by another. The segmentations of gender, race, and class have been supplanted by the segmentations of debt and credit. A man is no longer a man confined, but a man in debt. Deleuze, Negotiations. In effect, our body has been replaced as the principal site of power by our profile. But this does not mean that the age of the body has been succeeded by the age of the body without organs, as many of the internet inclined have argued, because the disciplined or segmented body was just as much a body without organs as is the ghostly profile that government agencies and banks now make of us and store in their databases for referral whenever we want a loan, a driver's license, or to leave the country for a vacation. It will no doubt come as a surprise to many that the clearest confirmation of this point, that the disciplined body is already a body without organs, is to be found in Foucault's Discipline and Punish, which is often read as a history of the body. Referring to Kantorowitz's influential thesis that the king effectively has two bodies, one that lives and dies and another that is immortal, Foucault writes, quote, "If the surplus power possessed by the king gives rise to the duplication of his body, has not the power exercised on the subjected body of the condemned man given rise to another type of duplication, that of a non-corporal, a soul, as Mably called it? This history of this microphysics of the punitive power would then be a genealogy or an element in the genealogy of the modern soul. Rather than seeing the soul as the reactivated remnants of an ideology, one would see it as the present correlative of a certain technology of power over the body. It would be wrong to say that the soul is an illusion or an ideological effect. On the contrary, it exists, it has a reality. It is produced permanently around, on, within the body, by the functioning of a power that is exercised on those punished, and, in a more general way, on those one supervises, trains, and corrects, over madmen, children at home and at school, the colonized, over those who are stuck at a machine and supervised for the rest of their lives." End quote. The soul is the body without organs seen in its disciplined aspect, but it is not the whole of the body without organs. Foucault's vision of the duplication of the body is an impoverished one in comparison to Deleuze and Guattari's, and he pays the price for this conceptual diminishment by leaving himself with no plausible means of explaining how or why one might adhere to the conventions and demands of the socius itself except through coercion. The full body without organs is the soul animated by desire. Foucault's description of the modern soul is instructive, nonetheless, because it points up the degree to which the body without organs is a social rather than individual concept. We all have our own body without organs, but it is plugged into a larger entity that is the body without organs of all bodies without organs, or the plane of consistency. This larger entity that all our individual bodies without organs are plugged into is society's own body without organs, and it is my contention that we can only properly understand this particular concept if we apprehend it at this level. The priority of Marx. As a first measure in standing this concept back on its feet, then, It has to be recognized that although Antonin Artaud is the source of the phrase body without organs, his work plays only a very small part in its theorization as a concept. This is not to say that Artaud is unimportant to Deleuze and Guattari, but the truth is they tend to treat his work as pre-philosophical, as a source of symptoms or ideas rather than concepts. Moreover, focusing on Artaud reinforces the misperception that the body without organs is the exclusive preserve of individuals. Correcting this view requires that we look to the concept's more important conceptual sources, Lacan, Spinoza, and Marx. This list may be in either ascending or descending order of importance, depending on how you look at things. Deleuze and Guattari attribute the invention of the concept to Lacan, but this seems to be of significance only inasmuch as they can use it against Lacanians. They suggest that the architecture of the concept was foreshadowed by Spinoza, and they take from this source the notions of longitude and latitude which they use to map the body without organs components. They reserve for Marx, however, the special distinction of showing us how this concept works in everyday life at the level of the mode of production. In light of this, I want to argue for the priority of Marx in any reading of the body without organs on the grounds that, to follow a Jamesonian logic, the Marxian position subsumes the other two. On its first, or Lacanian approximation, the body without organs is simply the constellation of partial objects constituting our desire in its transitive mode. It is described by Deleuze and Guattari as the real inorganization of desire, such as one finds on the reverse side of the big O. Quote, there, desire is shifted into the order of production, related to its molecular elements, where it lacks nothing, because it is defined as the natural and sensuous objective being, at the same time as the real is defined as the objective being of desire. Deleuze and Guattari, Anti-Oedipus. Desire, on this understanding, constantly surpasses the neat triangle of mummy-daddy-me imposed by psychoanalysis. On its second, or Spinozist approximation, the body without organs is the immanent substance, in the most Spinozist sense of the word. The partial objects, that is Lacan's petit a, are like its ultimate attributes, which belong to it precisely insofar as they are really distinct and cannot on this account exclude or oppose one another. But the significance of this insight can really only be seen when it is rewritten into a Marxian discourse, as Deleuze and Guattari do for us in the opening pages of Anti-Oedipus. If we want to have some idea of the forces exerted by the body without organs, then we must first establish a parallel between desiring production and social production. To put it another way, we have to establish that desire functions on the same level as the real. However, Deleuze and Guattari then go on to say this parallel is to be treated as strictly heuristic, at least in the first instance. Quote, its one purpose is to point out the fact that the forms of social production, like those of desiring production, involve an unengendered non-productive attitude, an element of anti-production coupled with the process, a full body that functions as a socius. This socius may be the body of the earth, that of the tyrant, or capital. This is the body that Marx is referring to when he says that it is not the product of labor, but rather appears as its natural or divine presupposition. Anti-Oedipus. This is the body without organs in its social aspect. It falls back on, il se rabat sur, all production, constituting a surface over which the forces and agents of production are distributed, thereby appointing for itself all surplus production, and arrogating to itself both the whole and the parts of the process, which now seem to emanate from it, as a quasi-cause. In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari transform this insight into an analytic principle. The body without organs has two phases, an initial phase of construction and a subsequent phase of making things circulate. Judith Butler has demonstrated that the concept of gender, not the actual experience of gender, follows precisely this course. What she effectively claims, without using this terminology, is that gender is an incorporeal transformation. The very labels man or woman seize and transform us. Gender is an attribute, an effect, that penetrates our bodies and functions there as quasi-cause of everything we do. We are not born into our gender, we assume it. But once it has taken hold, we act in its name. This effect interacts with other effects, such as race and class. As Butler points out, even if one accepted that it was possible to choose one's gender, it is nevertheless impossible to choose not to have any gender at all. You thus desire on gender. It is part of your body without organs. Gender is a rigged game. You can choose to be man, woman, or transgendered, but you cannot choose to be non-gendered because the very notion of sex, as some neutral biological, that is non-cultural given, is simply the other half of the equation. Gender and sex work together in a manner Deleuze and Guattari describe as bi-univocal. Each effect functions as the concrete proof of existence of the other. This is what it means to say they are quasi-causes. We oscillate between the two, jumping from one circle of hell to the other. Gender, Deleuze and Guattari argue, is the mechanism power needs to exert itself. Part of the difficulty Butler has in explaining how gender and sex differ from one another, yet operate together, stems from the fact that these terms have the appearance of being, as it were, unengendered or naturally occurring. But, as she effectively wants to argue, but doesn't quite have the vocabulary to do so, they are very far from naturally occurring. They are engendered, but in such a way that they seem to fall back on themselves and smother their origins from view, so as to appear unengendered. This is how the body without organs operates. Its chief operation is to fall back on itself and create a smooth plane for desire. This example points to what is perhaps the key feature of the body without organs. It functions as pure presupposition, that is, the thought or idea which thought cannot grasp. It is like our soul, always there, always in need of work, and always unreachable. The body without organs is not a feedback loop, as Bard and Söderqvist suggest, because what occurs on the body without organs is not the same thing, and isn't constructed in the same way as the body without organs itself. What occurs on the body without organs doesn't feed back into it. To continue the example above, if I cross-dress, I may be playing with my gender, but I'm not thereby altering it, whether on an experiential level or a theoretical level. By the same token, because the body without organs is a virtual entity, Katherine Hayles' complaint that it doesn't pay enough heed to physical constraints is without foundation. More to the point, conceptually, the body without organs should be understood as our way of coping with physical constraints. It is our means of fabricating a mental position from which to view the conditions of our everyday life as making sense. The Internet's body without organs. Presuppositions can sometimes be brought to light by asking, what ought to be? In the first years of the Internet, that is, the early 1990s, with the emergence of the World Wide Web, when it was still small enough to be contained on a single mainframe computer, the key permutation of this question was, according to Bill McKibben, whether it would be like TV, just another distraction, or whether it would really allow for the kind of connectedness it seemed to enable. McKibben thinks the answer is still not clear. More people use the web to look at unclothed young women and lose money at poker than for any other purposes. Setting aside the moralizing tone, the contrast with TV is instructive because, in its early days, television was subjected to considerable scrutiny and regulation by government, of a kind that varied quite widely from nation to nation. The Australian government, for instance, regarded it as a service and placed it in the same policy category as health and education. Interestingly, TV was thought too important and too dangerous, government grasped immediately the propaganda power of the new medium, to leave in private hands, and policy was developed accordingly. The basic tenets of Australian policy were that TV should be free, available to all. The infrastructural cost of this is staggering when you consider the dispersed nature of the population, and informative. All stations were required to provide news services as well as educational programming for children. It did not opt, however, for complete state control, as Britain did, but neither did it leave it all to the market as the US did, although even there the government placed severe restrictions on content. Australia aimed for a kind of middle ground that allowed for commercial applications, but kept a close eye on what those applications were. TV was essentially a national technology, and the issue of what it could and should be was a matter of national debate. The Internet has never been a national technology in this sense, so its development has not been overseen by a governmental body, except in the most ad hoc way, via band-aid legislation, which, in the case of child pornography, say, can do no more than ban certain practices and create the judiciary conditions needed to punish the offenders, but cannot actually stop it. And that is how things should be, according to the majority of Internet pundits, whether e-business billionaires or left-wing academics. Internet equals freedom. This is the Internet's body without organs. the great and unquestioned presupposition that it is an agent of freedom. The material problem confronting schizoanalysis is knowing whether the bodies without organs we have are any good or not, or more to the point, knowing whether we have the means of determining whether they are any good or not. The body without organs is an evaluative concept which, as Guattari instructs in his last book, Chaosmosis, should be used dialectically, which is to say, with a view towards an understanding of how it is produced. In other words, we should ask two basic questions. How is a particular body without organs produced? And what circulates on it once it has been produced? Just how enfeebled a concept of freedom the internet rhetoric implies was exposed by the press reaction to the story of Google's entry into the Chinese market, which is said to be growing by 20 million users a year and was already worth an estimated $151 million per annum in 2004, a figure that is literally tiny by US standards. But it doesn't take a genius to see that the potential for growth is huge, and with everyone predicting that China is going to be the next superpower, one can understand why Google would want a foothold. To be allowed to set up servers on mainland China and create a Google.cn service, which will be faster and better suited to the purpose than the regular US version Chinese people already have access to, Google had to agree to adhere to the Chinese government's regulation and control of internet content. This means complying with its 3 T's rule. Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen are all off limits, as are such search categories as human rights, Amnesty International, pornography, and of course Falun Gong. It is believed that there are 30,000 online police officers monitoring chat rooms, blogs, and news portals to ensure that these topics aren't discussed and these kinds of sites aren't accessed. Although this isn't the first time Google has agreed to cooperate with government and effectively censor its search results. In Germany, it restricts references to sites that deny the Holocaust, while in France, it restricts access to sites that incite racial violence. The scale of its compliance with the Chinese government's censorship requirements far exceeds anything it has done before. That Google chose to make these compromises as the necessary price of doing business in the world's fastest-growing economy was read by many as a betrayal of the values of freedom for which Google is supposedly an emblem. The fact that these jeremiads were largely confined to the business pages of liberal papers suggests that the notion of freedom they had in mind was largely of the freedom to do business kind wrapped up in the rhetoric of freedom of speech. The obviously self-serving acquiescence to censorship is defended by the company on the grounds that providing no information, or a heavily degraded user experience that amounts to no information, is more inconsistent. What this case demonstrated is that Google isn't really concerned about our access to content at all. All the bluster about compromised values was really just a verbal smokescreen to cover up this one glaring truth. Google's priority is its access to new markets, and it will not hesitate to compromise its putative ethic of do no evil in order to achieve that goal. If we regard Google as a gigantic multinational corporation, which with a net worth in excess of $80 billion, making it bigger than Coke, General Motors, or McDonald's, it in fact is, and not simply a search tool, then there should be little to surprise us in its about-face in China. It is only if we continue to buy into the fantasy that it, and somehow the internet as a whole, is a bastion of freedom, that we find these events dismaying. If the internet was ever a commons, to use the word anti-corporate commentators like Naomi Klein have made fashionable, then there can be no doubt that it is rapidly being enclosed, the implication being that Amazon, Google, and eBay are still only at the primitive accumulation stage. Information is, in effect, a natural resource like oil that Google exploits without regard for the environment, as all companies do when we aren't watching, and sometimes even when we are. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Google-led hype surrounding the convergence of internet and mobile phone technology. In an op-ed for the FT, Google CEO Eric Schmidt went on record saying that internet-enabled mobile phones would effectively solve the problem of how to gain access to emerging markets in underdeveloped countries, where the absence of landline infrastructure would otherwise have proved an impassable obstacle. He doesn't put it like that, of course. He's never so indelicate as to mention the dirty word market. His rhetoric is liberatory and egalitarian. The internet has democratized information, Schmidt claims, or at least it has for those who have access to it. And that, he says, is the problem. Not everyone has access. In sub-Saharan Africa, Schmidt laments, less than 1% of households have a landline. If that statistic wasn't bad enough for a business that presupposes the existence of such basic utilities as a functioning telephonic network, then there is the worse news that even if broadband was available to every household, it wouldn't change things all that much because very few people in this part of the world can afford computers. Mobile phones will liberate this technologically dark region by overcoming these twin obstacles to online access. On the blessed day when everyone has internet-enabled mobile phones, a schoolchild in Africa will be able to find research papers from around the world or to see ancient manuscripts from a library in Oxford. Schmidt. Until then, however, the digital divide prevents this democratizing magic from having its effect. According to Schmidt, thanks to the internet, we don't have to take what business, the media, or politicians say at face value, and this is empowering. Schmidt's view is that what is actually said online isn't as important as the freedom to say whatever one happens to want to say. Thus, he says, governments should stop focusing on how to control the web and concentrate on how to give internet access to more people in more countries. Government should, in other words, help Google to expand its market. By the same token, as Google's negative response to requests from US law enforcement agencies for assistance in tracking down users of child pornography illustrates, Google thinks the government shouldn't be allowed to impinge on its market. Although Yahoo, MSN, and AOL have been willing to help out, Google has held fast, citing the right to privacy as its rationale. But Google patently speaks with a forked tongue on this subject. Co-founder of Google, Larry Page, defended the company's refusal to help identify child pornographers by saying, rather tellingly, that the company relies on the trust of its users, and that giving out data on users would break that trust. His implication is obvious. If Google gave out data on its users, it would effectively turn customers away and eventually lose its preeminent place as market leader. Protecting market share is how we should understand Page's call for legislation that stops government from being able to ask for such data in the first place. But this doesn't mean Google actually respects the privacy of its users, if by that one means it doesn't keep them under surveillance. It is constantly gathering data on users, individually and collectively, and even publicizes this fact under the innocuous-sounding rubric of Google Trends by releasing maps of most frequently searched topics broken down by region. Eschewing any pretense to being scientific, these search maps make for titillating reading as one ponders what it means in cultural geographical terms that the most frequent Google searches in the city of St. Albans in Hertfordshire were for gyms, weight loss, and the Atkins diet. Does this make it the most self-absorbed city in Britain, as claimed by the Sunday Times, in a half-page piece studded with such tidbits of spurious psychosocial information gleaned from Google Trends? Obviously more of a lifestyle puff than a hard news piece, although it was in the news section, what is particularly striking about this article is its complete lack of sensitivity to the fact that such maps are the product of electronic surveillance. That is precisely the kind of thing the Sunday Times normally rails against. That a liberal paper like this doesn't see Google Trends as surveillance is evidence of just how little critical attention is paid to this dimension of the internet in the public sphere. I don't, however, want to give the impression that this is some kind of conspiracy, because the fact is Google is very open about its snooping. One Google executive, Marissa Mayer, has even said we should expect it. The rhizome. Is the internet a rhizome? All the straws in the wind say yes, it is. Quote, whereas mechanical machines are inserted into hierarchically organized social systems, obeying and enhancing this type of structure, the internet is ruled by no one, and is open to expansion or addition at anyone's whim, as long as its communication protocols are followed. This contrast was anticipated theoretically by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, especially in 1000 Plateaus, 1980, in which they distinguish between arboreal and rhizomic cultural forms. The former is stable, centered, hierarchical. The latter is nomadic, multiple, decentered, a fitting depiction of the difference between a hydroelectric plant and the internet. Mark Poster, What's the Matter with the Internet? There are, of course, excellent grounds for thinking that the internet meets some, if not all, of the basic criteria of the rhizome, which Deleuze and Guattari list as follows. The rhizome connects any point to any other point. Connections do not have to be between same and same, or like and like. The rhizome cannot be reduced to either the one or the multiple, because it is composed of dimensions, directions in motion, not units. Consequently, no point in the rhizome can be altered without altering the whole. The rhizome operates by variation, expansion, conquest, capture, and offshoots, not reproduction. The rhizome pertains to an infinitely modifiable map with multiple entrances and exits that must be produced. The rhizome is acentered, non-signifying, and acephalous. The rhizome isn't amenable to any structural or generative model. So, how well does the internet map against these 6 principles? At the bare machine level, it seems to agree with the first principle very closely. The ideal of the internet is that any computer can be connected to any other computer. How well this works in practice is another matter altogether, as anyone who has experienced the frustration of trying to access big sites using low bandwidth connections, such as dial-up, or has had to rely on servers clogged by high volumes of traffic, can readily attest. But the more interesting philosophical question here, which applies as much to Deleuze and Guattari as to the internet, is the premium we place on intention. Until the advent of search engines, of the capability of Google, it was extremely difficult to implement one's intent in relation to the internet. The phrase surfing the internet reflects this. Using the internet used to be, and in some cases still is, like looking for a needle in a haystack, and basically what one did in order to find something was surf from one site to another until one found it, hence the proliferation in the early 1990s of books listing useful websites, which themselves tended to be indexes or directories enabling you to find other sites. By the same token, little attention was given to domain names at this time, with the result many of them looked like nightmarish calculus equations rather than the user-friendly mnemonics we're accustomed to now. You move from one web address to another as though from one fixed point in space to another, which interestingly is not at all what surfers do. This brings us to the second principle. Here the match is a little less straightforward. For a start, the practical reality of the internet is nothing at all like the multidimensional sensorium envisaged by William Gibson when he first used the term cyberspace in his groundbreaking novel Neuromancer. But then again, he famously didn't even own a computer at the time. However, Gibson's vision of cyberspace has had a lasting influence, and many people do think of the internet as the realization of the Deleuzean ideal of multiplicity. But the incredible proliferation and constantly expanding number of websites does not by itself mean that the internet can be classed as a multiplicity in Deleuze's sense. Are websites dimensions or units of the web? There is a simple way to answer this question. What happens when we add or subtract a site? The answer is that it isn't clear that the addition or the subtraction of any one site actually affects the whole. If several million sites were to vanish, then that would clearly make a difference, but the loss of a few hundred or even several thousand might not. If sites were dimensions, then according to Deleuze and Guattari's definition of the rhizome, their removal would alter the whole, so we have to conclude that individual websites are units of the internet, not dimensions. Empirically, we know that the number of websites is important. There is, for example, a vast difference between the internet of today, which has hundreds of millions of specific sites and trillions of pages to go with them, and the internet of 1990, which had fewer than 200 sites and could be contained in its totality on a single PC. But this doesn't mean we have to abandon the idea that the internet is a multiplicity, because there is another way we can come at this problem. Thus we come to the third principle, that the rhizome operates by variation, expansion, conquest, capture, and offshoots, not reproduction, which is essentially a matter of population, and which, in contrast to the numbering, number can be grasped in dimensional terms. Darwin's two great insights, according to Deleuze and Guattari, were that the population is more significant than the type in determining the genetic properties of a species, and that change occurs not through an increase in complexity, such as the proliferation of individual websites or multiplication of web links entails, but rather the opposite, through simplification. Internet usage certainly bears this point out, as recent trends confirm. The internet is the standard source of product information. Everything from details of the latest designs to replacement user manuals are lodged there. It is also becoming the preferred point of sale as more and more business is conducted online, and it is steadily taking over from its rivals TV and radio the role of content provision, as podcasts and downloads become more the rule than the exception. In the process, the internet is changing how we understand media. On the one hand, it is steadily displacing the variety of media that used to exist, newspapers, magazines, TV, radio, and cinema, onto itself, while on the other hand it is absorbing new interactive functions, such as data searches and direct online sales, the other media can't offer. Paradoxically then, from the perspective of the user, the internet is without doubt the most powerful homogenizing and standardizing machine invented since money. Firstly, all pre-existing forms of media have been compelled to adapt themselves to suit the internet environment. Second, having stripped the traditional media of its exclusive reserve to make and distribute news, movies, or whatever, the internet has enabled a whole new kind of media production, from the so-called citizen journalists we hear so much about today, to bloggers, to home movie makers, and amateur photographers. Viewed from the perspective of the media as a whole, that is, from a population perspective, the internet has simplified what media means, and in the process set off a massive expansion of media operations into virtually every corner of existence. It is having the same effect on retail. The fourth principle, that the rhizome pertains to an infinitely modifiable map with multiple entrances and exits that must be produced, is, I would hazard, the most important. But its implications are neither obvious nor fully explained by Deleuze and Guattari. In effect, however, what it means is this: the rhizome is not manifest in things, but rather a latent potential that has to be realized by experimentation. This can be linked to the sixth principle, namely that the rhizome isn't amenable to any structural or generative model, because basically what Deleuze and Guattari are saying is that you can't either prescribe the rhizome into existence or expect to find it naturally occurring. It has to be invented. The rhizome is the subterranean pathway connecting all our actions, invisibly determining our decision to do this rather than that. Insofar as we remain unaware of its existence, and indeed its operation, we do not have full control over our lives. The rhizome is, in this sense, a therapeutic tool. For both statements and desires, the issue is never to reduce the unconscious, or to interpret it, or to make it signify according to a tree model. The issue is to produce the unconscious, and with it new statements, different desires. The rhizome is precisely this production of the unconscious. 1,000 Plateaus. The rhizome of the internet cannot simply be the pre-existing network of connected computers. Rather, we have to conceive it in terms of the set of choices that have been made concerning its use, and determine the degree to which the resulting grid is open or closed. The fifth principle, that the rhizome is acentered, non-signifying, and acephalous, appears to be one that could be left unchallenged. Yet if we were to grant that the internet is acentered, non-signifying, and acephalous in appearance, and indeed in its very construction, the reality of its day-to-day use still does not live up to this much vaunted Deleuzian ideal. Here we have to remind ourselves that Deleuze and Guattari regard the rhizome as a tendency rather than a state of being. It must constantly compete with an equally strong tendency in the opposite direction, namely towards what they term the arboreal. The internet exhibits arboreal tendencies, as well as rhizomatic tendencies, and any balanced assessment of it would have to take these into account, too, and weigh up their relative strength. To begin with, one still moves from point to point through the internet. There is no liberated line of flight in cyberspace. Moreover, Google searches are very far from disinterested, as John Battelle's path-breaking book, The Search, makes abundantly clear. Now that retailers can pay Google to link certain search items, what Google calls AdWords, to their business name, so that a search for a book, for instance, will always lead to Amazon or Abe Books or whoever, the minimal conceptual distinction that used to separate Google from the Yellow Pages has basically vanished. The operating premise of Google searches may not be that whenever we are searching, no matter what we are searching for, we are actually looking for something to buy, but its results certainly appear to obey this code. Insofar as we rely on Google as our user's guide to the internet we actually see and use is thus stable, centered, and hierarchical. That is, the very opposite of rhizomatic. Google searches are conducted on a stable electronic snapshot of the internet, not the living, breathing thing itself, which it indexes very precisely. The search engine is patently a centering system, de facto and de jure, and what could be more hierarchical than PageRank? This is not to say that Google isn't an extremely useful tool, because plainly it is, but it is to insist not only that it has its limitations, some of which are quite serious, but that it isn't the only means of searching for information available. A new problematic. If we were to follow Deleuze's watchword, that philosophy has the concepts it deserves according to how well it formulates its problems, then we would not start from the idea that the internet might be a body without organs, or that it looks like a rhizome, or indeed from any other pre-existing point of view. Instead, we would try to see how the internet works and develop our concepts from there. In its first flush, the internet seemed to be about connectedness, but that idea has since been exposed as a perhaps necessary but nonetheless impossible ideal, like the Lacanian conception of sexual relations, that we are at once compelled to try to realize, but destined never to succeed in doing so. Now, though, Battelle's work has made it clear that the internet is much more about searching than connecting. Although connecting people, strangers with strangers, friends with friends, is a major feature of the internet's cultural role, it is predominantly used to search for objects, that is, commodities, and in the case of pornography and celebrity gossip, one may well say it is searching for people in their guise as commodities. A lot of quite utopian claims have been made on behalf of the internet, the strongest being that it has so changed the way people interact that it has created a new mode of politics. But it now seems clear that it is just another model of realization, Deleuze and Guattari's term for the institutions capitalism relies on to extract surplus value from a given economy. That business couldn't immediately figure out how to make money out of the internet, that is, turn it into a model of realization, meant that in the early years of its existence, the utopian image of it as an affirmative agent of cultural change was able to flourish, giving the internet a powerful rhetorical legacy it continues to draw on, even as it is molded more and more firmly into a purely commercial enterprise. Google is effectively the common sense understanding of what using the internet actually means, both practically and theoretically. It is at once our abstract ideal of searching and our cumulatively acquired empirical understanding of it. But more importantly, searching is what we think of as the proper practice associated with the internet. One writes with the pen, makes calls with the phone, and searches the internet. When our searches don't yield the results we're after, we tell ourselves it is because we don't properly understand Google, that we don't have enough practical experience with it or sufficient competence to use it fully, rather than dismiss the search engine itself as fundamentally flawed. It is in this precise sense that Google has become, in neurological terms, the image of the search. Google's significance is clearly more cultural than technical, because it determines our view of internet technology itself, deciding for us, in advance and without discussion, what it is actually for. If the problem in the early days of the internet was that no one could foresee the range of its applications, and seemed to stand around waiting for history to decide instead of putting in place the appropriate legislation and policy to guide its development, some now think of as missing, the problem today is that everyone thinks they know what its application should be, namely, the facilitation of sales, and any sense that it might have a more progressive use has been consigned to the dustbin of fantasy. If there is something the matter with the internet, it is that its utopian beginnings block critical thoughts about its future, as though somehow its starting point was already the fabled end of history when the concrete and abstract became one. John Battelle's book says he wrote The Search because it was his sense that Google and its rival search engine companies had somehow figured out how to jack into our culture's nervous system. His account of the seemingly inexorable rise of the search engine giant, which is largely a standard corporate biography, is by turns alarmist and infatuated. He is in equal measure amazed by Google's power and disturbed by it. It is, however, Battelle's attempt to use Google's history to say something about contemporary culture that makes for the most fascinating reading, and whether we agree with his prognosis or not, I think we have to take it seriously. There can be no doubt that the internet is going to play an increasingly significant role in shaping cultural attitudes, behaviors, and practices in the future. Battelle's decision not to write a book about Google per se, but rather something like a Google effect, is undoubtedly wise. As much as a behemoth as Google is, there's no guarantee that it will be around forever. It may disappear, as AOL appears to be doing, as its business model founders in the face of Google's. Or it may be swallowed up by an even more aggressive predator such as Microsoft, presently 3 times the size of Google, measured in terms of market capitalization, which virtually wiped out its one-time competitor Netscape Navigator in the so-called browser wars of the 1990s. By the same token, none of the other major corporations, not eBay, nor Amazon, nor even the venerable Microsoft, can be considered immune to such forces of change. Indeed, Wall Street is worried that Microsoft won't be able to shake off the competition. It has no answer to Apple's iTunes, and it is losing the battle to control the web. It has also lately been reported that Google and Yahoo, as well as Microsoft, are cooking up plans to encroach on eBay's turf, though so far the results are disappointing to investors. But the business sector at least sees it as both inevitable and desirable. Commercial users of eBay apparently feel they have maxed out on that service, and to reach new customers, they need to access new providers. The internet seems to engender a kind of restlessness in us to always want to see what's just over the horizon, one click away. The success of Amazon, Google, and eBay, amidst the blaze of spectacular .com failures of the past decade, is intimately related to the way their sites facilitate searching. Google's strength in this regard is obvious, but we shouldn't overlook just how good Amazon and eBay are in their own highly localized domains. What these companies have cottoned onto is something we might call search engine culture. The internet thrives not because it can be searched, but because the search engines we use to navigate it respond to and foster the desire to search by constantly rewarding us with the little satisfactions of the unexpected discovery. A potent search engine makes us feel that the world really is at our fingertips, that we are verily becoming world. One can find objective evidence of the intensifying influence of search engine culture in the constant consumer demand for increased bandwidth and memory capacity to facilitate it. Most households in the West possess vastly more computing power than they could hope to use, except for such activities as searching the web. It may be that online business is only just now starting to take off and show genuine profits because it has only lately developed an appreciation of the architecture of the desire called searching. As John Lanchester puts it, Google has a direct line, if not quite to the unconscious dreaming mind of the world, at least to the part of it which voices its wishes. I believe the same is true of Amazon and eBay, and indeed a range of other internet services, such as online dating and grocery shopping, that are yet to produce corporations of the gigantic proportions as these icons. But I don't accept that Google is the global id, as Lanchester puts it, because to do so would be to accept that our deepest atavistic desire is to buy something, and there could be no more dystopian outlook than that. Neither is it the global body without organs, though, with a bit of work, it could be. And who knows what changes that might bring.